Hello, in this video we're going to discuss global warming part 6, how God created the weather. An understanding of how weather was created will make it easier for people to comprehend just how delicate the weather system is and how easy it is to destabilize it. So we're going to go through a process and we're going to look at how the planets were created by God. The first planet Heaven, and just what happened when God tried to introduce certain things into the environment. So how God created the first planet was in the vacuum of space with zero gravity. God had to survive, and in soul form, he retained a fragment of gravity element inside his skull from when he was created. This allowed God to move around slowly with gravity emitted from his hands. He can touch wormhole element, and what this produces is wormholes emitting particles, and the ability to create dimensions such as this universe and the field dimensions for stars. So there was a type of flake that God could emit from a wormhole exit point. By applying certain amounts of gravity, God could adjust what sort of particles were emitted. Some of the particles consisted of air, water. Water came out in flake form, already frozen. And there was one of the earliest things that he discovered was that when he emitted two types of flakes, when the two combined, it produced a reaction which produced light. So that's how God created his first work light. Later on, God found that there was another two types of flakes that were different from the others, and when those two combined, it was explosive reaction. It produced heat. So in soul form, he still felt cold and hungry and thirsty, and he had to find a way to survive. God found a way to live off a type of element that was emitted from wormhole exit point that is called mana, and when it clustered together it forms a type of biscuit. God would consume these in order to survive, as well as ice, and then later on he figured out a way to melt the ice and drink bubbles of water. So that's God's survival in that environment. And he managed to build rock, and how that's created was God created a furnace by combining two types of flakes which were emitted from two separate wormhole exit points. It produced heat. God had to build himself a heat shield to hide behind, and when a certain type of flake was combined with the heat, it melted, and that's where we get rock from. So using this material, God, by hand, made giant shell halves, which were sphere-shaped. And then one of the elements that God discovered that could be emitted from a wormhole exit point was a type of crystal that was gravity. So it's gravity crystals. And then God found a use for them. He found that they were a nuisance to work with in zero gravity. They'd always go where he didn't want them to go. It took a lot of finesse in order to control them. So eventually God was able to place the gravity crystals underneath the shell of the two halves and combine them, and by accident he discovered that it created atmosphere. So he made a smaller shell and combined them, and with the gravity crystals, it created an atmosphere, and he was able to emit air into there and breathe. In soul form, he could breathe. He doesn't need to breathe, but it's preferable. And he could also talk. So when he was in vacuum, he could not talk, but he could hear his voice when he was swearing and cursing, when he was pulled into the atmosphere. Fortunately, when it occurred, he had some wormhole element with him in the form of a staff, and he was able to use that to create a wormhole to go back to the orbit of that object, and he did not get killed by the fall. And this led to God later creating an even larger shell halves with the gravity crystals, and he put layers of rock and put air into the atmosphere, and he made tunnels using wormhole cutting, which we discussed earlier in another video. And so God then had a planet, and he was able to walk on it, which he loved, and it had gravity. So he found that he survived in zero gravity, but he found it more comfortable in gravity. But the problem was, in body form, it was still freezing. So God went back to the drawing board and built a furnace out of rock. And the first furnace smashed into the first planet heaven, and it made a mess. And explosive decompression almost killed him. Explosive super decompression almost killed him. So then God went back and made two shell halves and built the furnace, which is cylinder shaped and 15 miles high, and put that on top of the shell before he placed the atmosphere. And once that was in place and he put atmosphere, he found that he could live in that environment and create heat. So then he had light from the work light I described, although he created a second one in another dimension for heaven. And so with this furnace, he could turn it on and off by, it had catalyst at the bottom of it, which is a type of flake which was stuck to the sides of it, and then he put a wormhole that emitted another type of flake, which we'd call fuel. It's called trilithium, and that would react to the catalyst and combust. So that's how God created heat for the first planet heaven. And he would always have to go there, turn it on, and then after 7 days, 4 days come back and turn it off. It's quite a dangerous operation, and he had to use a wormhole element rod, and all he'd have to do was remove it, and then it would turn off. It was plugged into something. And eventually God created angels, and the angels were created the similar sort of process to how God was created, in chambers that consisted of wormhole element, and all he had to do was go inside using a wormhole and trigger the reaction of creation, which involves him applying a little bit of gravity and touching the side of the chamber at certain locations. So God created 2 batches of angels, and they lived in that environment. The first batch are called angel, and called Gabriel. So the first batch of angels, 5,000 Gabriels. The very first angel God created, his name is Batch. So that's where the word batch comes from. The second batch of angels are called angel, and among them was the first female called Angela. So Angela later died, and with the help of time travel, heaven was able to rescue her, so her soul was not lost. With regard to this environment, the angels and God used to play tag, and people still play tag to this day in heaven. They had an atmosphere and a furnace and light, so they could go outside, and God had placed drinking stations where there were troughs of water that they could put their heads in and drink. Other elements, other particles God could create is dirt and sediment and sand. So they used sand to line the floors of sphere-shaped chambers and the tunnels, and it made it a more comfortable environment to live in. I am the Archangel Daniel, and I'm from heaven.